Hello and welcome to a pre-recorded exclusive interview with Andrea Illy, chairman of Illy Cafe and co-chair of the Regenerative Society Foundation. This sadly is a pre-record. I'm so sorry I can't be with you all today. And one thing that means is that you can't have any Q&A as such, but if you want to post comments, please do in the Q&A box in the right-hand side of the screen. And I'm sure that's going to provoke a lot of debate. And I'm doubly sure that's going to provoke debate for two reasons. Firstly, Andrea built his career around coffee, which we all need. I've got my coffee this morning because it's still quite early as I'm pre-recording. But secondly, Andrea is at the center of efforts to make the coffee industry and other parts of the consumer goods chain more sustainable and more regenerative. And agriculture is one of those things that people don't pay nearly enough attention to when they're thinking about net zero, but is absolutely crucial. And it's doubly crucial because groups like Illy Cafe are currently looking at not just creating net zero targets, but potentially bringing them further forward. So, Andrea, welcome. A lot to talk about today. And I guess I should start by asking you, what exactly is the Regenerative Society Foundation, and why does it matter to a group like Illy Cafe that's involved in the coffee business?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today and answer your question. The Regenerative Society Foundation has been founded with the aim of partnering with businesses for the so-called ecological transition from the past and present extractive model, which keeps depleting natural resources, to a new regenerative model, which is based on circular economy and One Health, so including the people's well-being. With that, there is a lot of knowledge to be shared, a long learning curve ahead. And the idea is to really create a community of companies engaged and share with them the best practices and share also resources for research in order to accelerate this transition.
So in terms of the role of Illy Cafe, I mean, perhaps you can give us some sense, first of all, how long have you been talking about regenerative agriculture or regenerative production and trying to look at your supply chain within the company?
So Illy has been engaged in sustainability since its foundation over 90 years ago, following the principles of circular economies in all packaging choices, energy consumption, and so on. We started working hand in hand with coffee growers at the beginning of the 90s in order to increase our capacity to source sustainable quality beans, which were endangered by climate change. And so more recently, after having addressed most of the, let's say, actions for adapting to climate change, we started addressing key let's say, a fundamental program for mitigation, because agriculture altogether, not necessarily the coffee one, is the second most important carbon emitter. So if we want to, let's say, reach the Paris Agreement goals to be carbon-free in 2050, every individual and every organization in the planet will need to be carbon-free. So we decided to start duly in advance and possibly be carbon-free to celebrate our centennial anniversary in 2033. So this is the goal we set. But the most important aspect is how to do so. Because our idea, and this is where regenerative agriculture came to play, is to try to make it in a circular way. Compress as much as possible the so-called industrial emissions after having converted all energy sources to renewable and having made every process as efficient as possible. Still, the uncompressible part of the industrial part to be kind of buried in the same soil where we grow coffee. Because yes, the magic of regenerative agriculture is that by enriching soil with biomass, which is basically organic carbon, you not only make these soils more fertile and resilient, but also you boost biodiversity, which is good for not only for the coffee quality, but for the health of all the ecosystems where coffee is grown. So with that, I personally, with my scientific background, because I'm a chemist by background, went back to my school books and studied a model which I call virtuous agriculture, which is regenerative and beneficial for health.
So just to ask a really dumb question, I mean, does coffee emit a lot of carbon in the course of the cultivation of carbon? Is it particularly damaging to the landscape? Because, we've all known about things like the palm oil industry and some of the problems around the cocoa industry, but coffee doesn't really hit the headlines very much in terms of its environmental impact.
Coffee is a tropical crop and is grown in over 40 countries. It depends on how you grow it, because if it is grown in a natural way, kind of agroforestry, for example, then it is even carbon negative. If you grow it in a, let's say, industrialized way with a very high productivity, the so-called conventional agriculture practices, which are monoculture and very intense in the uses of agrochemicals, in that case, it emits some carbon. We don't have comparable data with other crops, but we know that this is lower than other crops, also because it's a perennial plant. However, the idea is to make it carbon negative as much as possible.
So do you have a sense that your investors care about this or your consumers care about this? I mean, are other coffee companies doing the same thing, or are you trying to use this as a source of business strategy and advantage to say that you are going to be net zero?
Absolutely. Coffee has been one of the very first sectors under scrutiny for sustainability, because when we talk about sustainability, we have to consider the triple bottom line. So economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Because sometimes, let's say the coffee prices are very cyclical and volatile. Sometimes it happens they are reached so low level, creating some social development problems. And this is where sometimes some NGOs came to attack the big coffee multinationals, saying, hey, you shall not take advantage of these low prices. You shall care more for communities and so on. So very similarly, coffee came under scrutiny many decades ago because maybe until half a century ago, not now any longer, there was a lot of deforestation and also pollution related, particularly water pollution related to coffee. So all this is gone because coffee has been one of the very first sectors to react toward a long-term sustainability journey. And the good news is that we don't deforest any longer for growing coffee, even because all the coffee, let's say, increased production is due to productivity increase. We don't pollute any longer. There has been a substantial improvement in the social conditions for labor, both wages and also social conditions. And so really the last step is to really address now mitigation to climate change. And this is, we are happy to kind of lead this action. We know that most of the time, if something positive is done in the industry, colleagues in the industry tend to follow the footsteps. So we hope to be a kind of a role model for mitigating climate change.
So how easy, though, is it to track what is actually happening in your supply chain? Because, first of all, there's a lot of emphasis now on scope 3, trying to take a holistic view of what's happening. Can you get the data to do that, particularly given that so much of your production is located in developing markets where there may not be the same level of data oversight? And also, I'm curious, are your own suppliers able to make the kind of shifts that you're demanding? Or do you have to supply them with credit and logistical support to actually make that shift in the supply chain?
So Illy did pioneer direct sourcing in 1991 because we were nearly saturating our sources for high quality beans. And we did circumvent any, let's say, rings of the long supply chain to go working directly with coffee growers. We started with an award, which is now called, is an international award, which is award 9 countries every year. It's called Ernesto Illy International Coffee Award. And we are awarding the sustainable quality of the best coffee lots produced in the 9 countries where we source from. Immediately after having started this award, we realized that there was a significant need of knowledge transfer, helping growers to not only elevate their agronomical practices to maximize sustainable quality, but also to reach much more consistency over time. So we found that over 20 years ago now, the University of Coffee, which is the only existing one, were divided in 3 different departments, one for coffee growers, one for coffee professionals in the hospitality, and one for coffee connoisseurs. And of course, the department working with coffee growers is present in every country we source from, and our team of agronomists visits a minimum 200 farms per year to transfer knowledge and also to audit those farms. And we are happy to say that we can get enough data because there's really a partnership relationship with those growers. It's a community, as a matter of fact. We even have a circle which is called Circolo Illy, all growers working with Illy belonging to this Circolo Illy community where they can share knowledge among themselves. So yes, we can get this data. We can stimulate them to the recent, let's say, development in regenerative agriculture. And I'm pleased to say that even in those regions where the transition from conventional agriculture to a regenerative one is more difficult, we are getting extremely quick responses.
Fascinating. I'm curious, how realistic is it to bring forward the net zero target for you? And do you think that you will, have to face pressure to bring it forward even more? I mean, is it 2030 that you're now targeting? And is that going to be good enough?
Well, it is realistic, but there is a prerequisite. A net zero target depends on the availability of renewable energy along all the value chain. As long as you compress the current emissions to less than half thanks to the energy transition, then you create the possibility to really compensate the residual industrial emissions in the, let's say, ecosystems where our coffee is grown. So this is the model. So it very much, of course, we are directly responsible, as you mentioned, of any Scope 1 activities. We are not directly responsible of Scope 2 and Scope 3. So what we can do is to, first of all, have a clear strategy and engage our stakeholders into this, let's say, journey. We can transfer knowledge to them and have as much as possible moral suasion, but we cannot guarantee that we will be in the capacity to source 100% renewable energy by 2033, and also transition all growers were supplying our coffee from conventional agriculture to regenerative one. What I can see from our past is that when we launched this Ernesto Illy Award in 1991, a decade later, our business was totally transformed. So 10 years can be a very short time, but could also be a very fast one, a very, very long one. It's a bet, but it shall not be a bet, it shall be a vision, an objective, a commitment and work very hard for that. This is exactly what we commit to do.
Right, right. In terms of looking at who is going to act as a driver of change, do you see the private sector having to take the lead here? Do you want the government to be more active? Do you see NGOs as being the main driver here? I mean, how do you see the kind of interaction between those three groups at the moment?
So, of course, the private sector is always the leading stakeholder, because the private sector represents 2/3 of the global economy, GDP, both in terms of GDP, in terms of labor, innovation, whichever number you want to analyze, is the private sector leading it. Companies, therefore, are the number one stakeholder, and they do have a strategic interest to invest in this ecological transition. First of all, because it's about ensuring their business continuity, not only from the business point of view, but also from literally the supply chain one. Ensuring business continuity also because we shall consider what it means for a business not to, let's say, engage in the sustainability cause. You will have tremendous pressure from consumers, from trade, and from financial institutions, which eventually will create a lot of cost increase and liabilities. So I consider the journey towards sustainability a very good business also for corporations to be more competitive. And I think that this way of thinking is spreading now around in markets, and now with all this ESG, which is a very good also way to promote this ecological transition. So I think that the governments need to play their traditional role, which is to create conditions. Create conditions means fixing most of the institutional frameworks which are needed. For instance, do you want to continue subsidize agriculture? Okay, do so, but subsidize regenerative agriculture, not the conventional one. Do you want to favor the energy transition? Okay, subsidize renewable energy, not the fossil any longer. And do you want to reduce carbon emissions and invest for ecosystem recovery from the damage of climate change? Okay, introduce a carbon tax and so on. Do you want to generate knowledge and also measurement systems to measure the needs and impacts of sustainability? Do invest substantial public funds in R&D. This is what the public sector can do, but the rest should be really led by corporations.
Do you use a carbon tax internally for your accounting purposes, or a putative carbon tax number? And if so, what kind of number is it? And are you trying to embrace these new SASB accounts, these new forms of trying to measure sustainability in your own accounting system?
Not yet. We don't yet have a kind of a sustainability accounting. We are now more focused on our roadmap towards net zero, which is a big commitment because we have 64 projects along all the value chain. But we might consider this idea to start. We started this year the so-called non-financial disclosure. So that means that the information we report in our annual report will become more and more granular. So one day we might quantify also the carbon tax equivalent, but we shall give a value to that. There is not yet an official value in the market for carbon for the carbon credit. So it's difficult to give a value.
Right. A lot of companies we speak to say that the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, has changed some of their calculations about how they actually achieve net zero or move towards that. And I'm talking to you from America, where there's been a massive backlash that started recently against ESG, and many Republican politicians saying we just can't afford it. We can't afford to move away from fossil fuels. How does that play into your vision of the future? Are you basically slowing down your net zero targets because of the energy crisis?
Well, of course, these big externalities like the COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine are big distractions from a fundamental, let's say, track towards the ecological transition. But as far specifically, both are also increasing the opportunity, because when we speak about COVID, for instance, people are now much more conscious that their health and well-being depends upon the health of the ecosystems they live. So they are much more environmental conscious compared to 2019. Mm-hmm. And so this triggers much more awareness and desire to transition as soon as possible to a more sustainable world. Same for Ukraine, which is basically an energy war, because the cost of energy is boosting, exploding literally in Europe so much that, of course, it will be only a mental, let's say only a very, as you say, unwise person would continue to invest heavily in fossil fuels when you know that they are damaging so severely the environment, and they are so expensive and they have no future. So this should be and must be creating probably the biggest opportunity for investing in renewable energy. And I hope it's already happening. In Italy only, we had 5 times as many renewable energy investment this year after the beginning of the war compared to before the war. So,
well, countries like Italy are obviously raising renewable energy, but what about the developing markets, which may not have the same resources to do that, and where, again, so much of your sourcing is located?
Well, developing markets until now are very low emitters. So even if we have a kind of delay, it will be okay. In the meantime, developed economies will develop, let's say, very effective technologies at affordable costs. Now we already reached the grid parity for many renewable energies. And many of those technology of renewable energies, the first generation one is being exported to Africa, for instance, like all solar panels or all batteries used for creating renewable energy in Africa. But one day, the cost of renewable energy will become so cheap that we will be in the condition to have a so-called quantum leap. Instead of building a grid in Africa, we will be able to electrify houses one by one with solar panels and batteries. And this will be led by large countries like Chinese, which are already leading this technological development. So I think that there is a very limited, let's say, delay. In maybe 10 years later, we will be able to convert also the south of the world.
Well, thank you, Andrea, for talking to us. Thank you for helping us all to get up in the morning with our cups of coffee. I know I certainly couldn't survive without mine. And very best of luck in pushing forward this very important debate. The reality is, unless we all change our daily habits, unless we all change the way we structure our lives and all corners of the global economy, we're not going to get to net zero. And coffee is definitely part of that. So thank you very much indeed. And now it's my great pleasure to hand over to John Sedgwick, Managing Editor of the Ignites Asia with the Financial Times, who's going to be moderating the next session. Thank you.